Hi, this is Mrs. Chavez. Today we're starting Chapter 2. It's an introduction to the early river valley civilizations. Two rivers flowed from the mountains of what is now Turkey down through Syria and Iraq and finally to the Persian Gulf. Over 6,000 years ago, the waters of these rivers provided the lifeblood that allowed the formation of farming settlements. These grew into villages and cities. A desert climate dominates the landscape that's between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea in Southwest Asia. Within this dry region lies an arc of land that provided some of the best farming in Southwest Asia. The region's curved shape, if you take a look at it, it starts over here, this curved shape coming around here, all the way down over to here. That's called the Fertile Crescent, and it includes the lands that are facing the Mediterranean Sea and a plain that becomes known as Mesopotamia. The word in Greek means the land between two rivers. So the rivers framing the Mesopotamia are the Tigris and the Euphrates. They flow southeast toward the Persian Gulf. Now, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded Mesopotamia at least once a year, but not always at the same time. So as the floodwaters receded, it left a thick bed of mud called silt. Farmers planted grain in this river and new soil and irrigated the fields with the river water. And the results were large quantities of wheat and barley at harvest time. The surpluses from their harvest allowed the villages to grow in this area. People first began to settle and farm that flat, swampy land in southern Mesopotamia before 4500 BCE. Around 3300 BCE, the people called the Sumerians arrived on the scene. Good soil was the advantage that attracted these settlers. However, there were three disadvantages to their new environment. Unpredictable flooding was one, and the major. It would combine with a period of little or no rain. There would go long periods of dry season and then a rainy season that lasted long enough to flood areas where you couldn't plant. So the land sometimes also became so dry it was like a desert. So they also had no natural barriers. A Sumerian village was almost defenseless. The natural resources of Sumer were also limited. Building materials and other necessary items were scarce to come by. Over a very long period of time, the people of Sumer created solutions to deal with these problems. To provide water, they dug irrigation ditches that carried river water to their fields and allowed them to produce a surplus of crops. For defense, as you look at the picture here, you can see they had these beautiful walls all around the city, okay? And Sumerians traded their grain, cloth, and crafted tools, and they made trades with the people of the mountains who had resources that they needed in that desert area. In exchange, they got raw materials such as stone and wood and metals. Now, these activities required organization, they required cooperation and leadership. It took many people working together, for example, for the Sumerians to construct their large irrigation system. Leaders were needed to plan the projects and supervise the digging. These projects also created a need for laws to settle disputes over how land and water would be distributed. These leaders and laws were the beginning of organized government and eventually of civilization. By 3000 BCE, the Sumerians had built a number of cities, each surrounded by fields of barley and wheat. Although these cities shared the same culture, they developed their own governments, each with their own rulers. Each city and the surrounding land it controlled formed what we call a city-state. A city-state functioned just like an independent country does today. Sumerian city-states included Uruk, Kish, Lagash, Eridu, Nippur, and Ur. Now, Ur was the center of the Sumerian cities, right down here. You can see it right there, okay? And it had a huge walled temple, and it had a ziggurat in the middle. There were priests and rulers who appealed to the gods for the well-being of the city-state. Sumer's earliest governments were controlled by the temple priest. The farmers believed that the success of their crops depended upon the blessings of the gods, and the priest acted as the go-between with the gods and the people. In addition to being a place of worship, the ziggurat was like a city hall. From the ziggurat, the priest managed the irrigation system. Priests demanded a portion of every farmer's crop as taxes. In times of war, however, the priest did not lead the city. Instead, the men of the city chose a top fighter who could command the city's soldiers. At first, a commander's power ended as soon as the war was over. After 3000 BCE, wars between cities became more and more frequent. Gradually, Sumerian priests and people gave commanders permanent control of their standing armies. In time, some military leaders became full-time rulers, and these rulers usually passed their power on to their sons, who eventually passed it on to their own heirs. A series of rulers from a single family is called a dynasty. After 2500 BCE, many Sumerian city-states came under the rule of dynasties. Sumer city-states grew prosperous from the surplus food produced on their farms. These surpluses allowed Sumerians to increase long-distance trade, exchanging the extra food and goods for items they needed. By 2500 BCE, new cities were arising all over the Fertile Crescent and what is now what we call Syria today, and northern Iraq and Turkey. The Sumerians exchanged products and ideas, such as living in cities with neighboring cultures. This process in which a new idea or product spreads from one culture to another is called cultural diffusion. The belief system, the social structure, the technology, and the arts of the Sumerians reflected their civilization's triumph over its dry, sometimes very harsh environment. Like many people in the Fertile Crescent, the Sumerians believed that many different gods controlled the various forces in nature. The belief in more than one god is called polytheism. Enlil, that's the god of storms and air, was among the most powerful of the gods. Sumerians feared him as the raging flood that has no rival. Demons are known as Ugalu. They protected humans from the evil demons who caused them to have disease and misfortune and misery. Sumerians described their gods as doing many of the same things humans do: falling in love, having children, quarreling, going to war, and so on. Yet the Sumerians also believed that their gods were both immortal and all-powerful. Humans were nothing but their servants. At any moment, the mighty anger of the gods might strike, sending a fire, a flood, or an enemy to destroy the city. To keep the gods happy, the Sumerians built impressive ziggurats for them and offered rich sacrifices of animals and food and wine. Sumerians worked hard to earn the gods' protection in this life, yet they expected little help from the gods after death. The Sumerians believed that the soul of the dead went to a place called the Land of No Return. It's a dismal, gloomy place between the earth's crust and the ancient sea. There was no joy waiting there for those souls. A passage in a Sumerian poem describes the fate of the dead soul as dust is their fare and clay their food. Some of the richest accounts of Mesopotamian myth and legends appear in a long poem called the Epic of Gilgamesh. With civilization came the beginning of what we called social classes. Kings, landholders, and some priests made up the highest level in Sumerian society. Wealthy merchants ranked next. The vast majority of ordinary Sumerian people worked with their hands in the field and in workshops. At the lowest level of Sumerian society were the slaves. Some slaves were foreigners who had been captured during war. Others were Sumerians who had been sold into slavery as children to pay the debts of their parents. Debt slaves could hope to eventually buy their freedom, though. Social class affected the lives of both men and women. Sumerian women could work as merchants and farmers and artisans. They could hold property in their own name. Women could also join the priesthood. Some upper-class women did learn to read and write, though Sumer's written records mention very few female scribes. However, Sumerian women had more rights than women in many later civilizations. Historians believe that the Sumerians invented the wheel, the sail, and the plow, and they are among the first to use bronze. Many new ideas and inventions came from the Sumerians' practical needs. Arithmetic and geometry. In order to erect city walls and building plans, plan irrigation systems, and survey flooded fields, Sumerians needed arithmetic and geometry. They developed a number system, it's based in 60, which stems the modern units of measuring time. 60 seconds equals 1 minute, and the 360 degrees of a circle. Architectural innovations like arches, columns, ramps, and the pyramid shaped the design of the ziggurat and permanently influenced Mesopotamian civilizations. Cuneiform. Sumerians created this system of writing. One of the first known maps was made on a clay tablet about 2300 BCE. Other tablets contain some of the oldest written records of scientific investigation in the areas of astronomy and chemistry and medicine. From 3000 down to 2000 BCE, the city-states of Sumer were almost constantly at war with each other. This weakened them. The weakened city-states could no longer ward off attacks from the people of the surrounding deserts and hills. Although the Sumerians never recovered from attacks on their cities, their civilization didn't die. Succeeding sets of rulers adopted the basic ideas of Sumerian culture to meet their own needs. About 2350 BCE, a conqueror named Sargon defeated the city-states of Sumer. Sargon led his army from Akkad, which was a city-state north of Sumer. The Akkadians had long before adopted most of the aspects of Sumerian culture. Sargon's conquest helped to spread that culture and even farther beyond the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. By taking control of both the northern and the southern Mesopotamia, Sargon created the world's first empire. As empires bring together several people, nations, or previously independent states under the control of one ruler. At its height, the Akkadian Empire loosely controlled land from the Mediterranean coast in the west to the present-day Iran in the east. Sargon's dynasty only lasted 200 years, after which it declined due to internal fighting, invasions, and famine. In about 2000 BCE, nomadic warriors known as Amorites invaded Mesopotamia. Gradually, the Amorites overwhelmed the Sumerians and established their capital at Babylon on the Euphrates River. The Babylonian Empire reached its peak during the reign of Hammurabi from 1792 BCE down to 1750 BCE. Hammurabi's most enduring legacy is the code of laws that he put together. Hammurabi recognized that a single uniform code of laws would help to unify those populations that were so diverse in his empire. He collected all the existing rules and judgments and laws into what he called the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi had the code engraved in stone, and copies were placed all over the empire. The code listed 282 specific laws dealing with everything that affected the community, including family relations, business conduct, and crime. Since many people were merchants, traders, or farmers, for example, many of the laws related to property issues. Additionally, the laws sought to protect women and children from unfair treatment. The laws tell us a great deal about the Mesopotamian beliefs and what they valued. Although the code applied to everyone, it set different punishments for rich and poor and for men and women. It frequently applied the principle of retaliation, that's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, to punish crimes. The prologue of the code sets out its goal for this body of law. It said, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and evildoers so that the strong should not harm the weak. Thus, Hammurabi's code reinforced the principle that government has a responsibility for what occurs in society. For example, if a man was robbed and the thief was not caught, the government was required to compensate the victim. Nearly 2 centuries after Hammurabi's reign, the Babylonian Empire, which had become much smaller, fell to the neighboring Kassites. Over the years, new groups dominated the Fertile Crescent. Yet the later people, including the Assyrians, the Phoenicians, and Hebrews, would adopt many ideas of early Sumerians. Meanwhile, a similar pattern developed. The rise and fall was taking place in the west, along the Nile River in Egypt.